Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is Rainer Kattel. I am a professor and deputy director at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to this evening. And I will do a very brief introduction to the series we have here, and then I'll give the floor to our panel today. And so, yeah, I'm very happy that you all came here for the third lecture and panel discussion in our series about innovation and the welfare state. So at UCL, what we're really focusing on is the idea of public value. And what we are looking at is, if you look at public sector organizations today or public policies today, they are really based on a very specific kind of economics, which really doesn't know the idea of public value. So if you ask an economist to define what is a public value, why do we do public policies, why do we have public organizations, why do we have British Library, they can't really tell you that. And that's really odd, isn't it? So because we should really be able to tell, why do we have British Library, why it is good for. And this is what we're really trying to bring back to economics, if you will, or bring back to the public policy, that there should be the idea of public value. Why do we do these things? Why do we do policies? Why do we fund these kind of organizations like BBC, British Library, and so on and so forth? So and that's really one of our focuses. And the other thing that is really interesting for us is the entire idea of the welfare state. So how can you bring together the idea of innovation economy, and the welfare state? So you have this discussion or discourse out there that essentially says that welfare state is a cost and innovation is good, right? Welfare state is cost, innovation is good. So with this series, together with the British Library, what we're really trying to do is actually think of these things together, innovation and the welfare state, because we think they actually really go together. If you do them right, they have to go together, and this is how you can really and should think about public value. And as I said, we are really in the middle of our second series with British Library. We are very proud to join forces with British Library and Roly Keating, Chief Executive of the British Library. And we have 3 more events coming up this summer, so you all have flyers. And all of you who are on Facebook, Google, or go to our website. Next event, I think, is on June 11th. And they're all really interesting, really great. And we have also, next week, we have an upcoming lecture by Philip Mirowski about open science, which is on Tuesday at UCL. Again, there is a flyer for that. It's another really interesting event. And that's pretty much it from me today. So I will give floor to Roly Keating, who is a very good friend of IIPP. And of course, many of you might know Roly Keating from his role both as a chief executive here at British Library and from his previous job and work at BBC. And I think Roly is one of those rare people in the public sector who really have thought about the idea of public value and public purpose and from a very different aspects. And so we are very happy to cooperate with Roly and to have him as a friend. So, floor is yours, Roly.
Rainer, thank you very much indeed. Welcome everyone to the British Library. It's very nice to see you all here. Welcome, by the way, also to anyone who may be joining us online on the Facebook page of IIPP. As Rainer said, this is a partnership of great significance to us at the British Library. We've got a shared concern, I think, for the role of institutions in innovation and in public life. For me personally, Rainer mentioned my background was at the BBC. I came to the British Library in 2012. But before that, I was at the Beeb doing many different jobs, controller of BBC Two, I was a programme maker, but also was involved in arguing the case for the existence of the BBC in the charter renewal of 2004. And I think that was when we got very involved in debates around public value as a measure of achievement, as a measure of purpose in a public institution. And years later, I found myself debating these matters with Mariana Mazzucato, who then created the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And I guess I'm one of, as Rainer says, the friends of the organisation actually trying to live some of this stuff in the real world, actually make real decisions about how you run an institution while thinking as seriously as we can about purpose. So tonight's topic within this sequence, we call access to knowledge and inequality, is one that is particularly of special interest to us here at the BL. We describe our whole mission these days as living knowledge, about making everything we hold here accessible to everyone for research, inspiration and enjoyment. The everything we hold, as some of you regulars will know, is quite a lot. Literally below our feet are 5 stories of material, of space containing some of the 170 million plus physical items we hold. Somewhere here there are servers churning away with the 500 terabytes and growing of digital content that we hold and preserve and have a duty to preserve 2-3 centuries into the future and make accessible in the here and now. And as we try and make that knowledge come to life for science, for culture, education, research, we 5 years ago put the word everyone into our mission statement. And this is an institution that maybe at its birth in the post-war era was thought to be largely skewed to academia and maybe big industry, and increasingly we've tried to turn that inside out and say that this material, this knowledge, is everyone's birthright, not just in the UK, but actually even internationally. So we have thought about these issues, we worry about them, we don't know the answers, which is one of the reasons it's fantastic to have Victor and Madeleine here tonight. In the context of the theme of this series, we've been having debates about are libraries part of the welfare state or not. We think probably not in a technical sense, but we were undoubtedly born out of a great wave of post-war institution building. We didn't have a separate national library, and it was thought that the nation should, and we were here to contribute to social growth, economic growth, born, I suppose, out of that white heat of technology moment in the 1960s. That was around the time, of course, of the Great Public Libraries Act, strengthening the idea of a right, really, to access to knowledge for everyone, free at the point of use, that great built infrastructure right across the UK of public libraries. Flash forward to now, and you could say that in a, and we're going to talk about this, a data-driven age, a so-called knowledge economy, theoretically, we feel like we should be at a moment of maximum empowerment around free access to knowledge, and there have indeed been extraordinary innovations. But I think equally we all feel that the reality, some 30 years into this revolution, is much more complex and much more difficult than that. And we find ourselves worrying about monopolistic power, about disinformation, social division, exclusion, online harms. The government came to this institution to launch its online harms white paper not very long ago. And so these things are very, very close to our heart. And I think our topic really tonight is about the currently unequal distribution to the knowledge that is meant to be driving this new economy, the access to it. And I guess our questions, if we can define it, is how can access to knowledge be made more inclusive rather than less, which sometimes feels the case, and maybe more ambitiously, if we have time, if we get that right, what kind of reformed or improved society could be built if we make that work. We have 2 speakers who we're delighted to have with us to consider these questions. Shortly we'll be hearing from someone well known really to anyone who knows or cares about health provision, housing, social enterprise in the UK. Crossbench peer Lord Victor Adebowale, chair of many social enterprises and organisations including visionable.com and Collaborate. But I think maybe to come to our first speaker, Madeleine Gabriel, who has been 5 years with Nesta, which calls itself the Innovation Foundation, an organisation, foundation, think tank, thought leader, constantly questioning and challenging how you innovate in society across public, third sector and commercial institutions. Madeleine's role there is as head of inclusive innovation, and the timing of this couldn't be better because only a couple of months ago she was co-author of a newly published and very, very broad-ranging and impressive report with Roberto Ungar and others called Imagination Unleashed, Democratising the Knowledge Economy. So we thought, Madeleine, if it's okay, we might come to you first to give some initial reflections on these questions that we've been raising.
Thanks, Roly, and good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for having me. So given the theme of access to knowledge and inequality, I thought I'd start by talking about what maybe links those two ideas with respect to the role of knowledge in the economy. And as Roly mentioned, Nesta is an innovation foundation, so we promote innovation. It's in our lifeblood. We say our mission is to bring big ideas to life, to change the world for the better. But there's a problem we've been grappling with. So the idea is that the model of innovation and technology-led growth, which is really the dominant development model in the world at the moment, and we all thought that this would lead in the end to more equal social and economic outcomes. It would be a force for global social and economic inclusion, but actually it's having the opposite effect. So we're seeing widening geographical and social divides. So it's a real paradox for us, and this model that we've been pushing actually isn't working. So we have to think about what can we do instead. And we've recently published a report, as Roly mentioned, on democratising the knowledge economy. It's one I prepared earlier. There are some copies if anyone would like one at the end, and you can find it also on Nesta's website. So I'll talk about a few ideas in that report. So the starting point was really three big problems that have global relevance. So one of those is high levels of inequality. So globally, actually, inequality has been reducing because there are fewer numbers of really poor people, and that's obviously a good thing. But within countries, within most countries, and certainly within rich countries, inequalities are widening. And you'll probably be familiar with some of the stats regarding increasing concentrations of wealth. So just one from Oxfam earlier this year pointed out that I think 26 people globally now own as much as 50% of the world's population. So we're seeing these huge inequalities. The second problem that this report addresses is around stagnant productivity. So productivity is an obsession for economic policymakers and those working in innovation, and it refers to output per worker. It's often thought about as, or spoken about as an end in itself, which I think is a problem. It's not an end in itself. We care about it because rising productivity in businesses allows them to pay their workers more and should give people a better quality of life. So we care about productivity because it's a relationship with wages. And you might know that in the UK, although we have at the moment very high employment levels, we also have low productivity and really low wage growth. And then the third problem that this report addresses is related to both of those things, and it's political alienation. So if you have an economy where some people are owning increasing amounts of wealth and wages aren't growing, you get this sense of people being left behind, and we're seeing that people are kind of feeling that modern institutions don't meet their needs. So we collaborated with Professor Roberto Unger on this report, and he's a politician and professor of philosophy, originally from Brazil, now based at Harvard University. And he's a very interesting guy, and he has a really interesting take on some of these issues. So his starting point is that economic eras can be characterized by their most advanced form of production. And at the moment, that most advanced form of production can be found in the knowledge economy. So very briefly, what's the knowledge economy? So you'll probably know it as well as I do, but it covers sectors such as software, pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, but also things like the creative industries, arts, films, video games, design, and so on. So anything where knowledge embodied in people and things is essential for production, consumption, and distribution of goods. And this is currently in the UK and in most other advanced countries where we find our most productive frontier firms, so the ones that are really driving economic growth. And what are these advanced production practices that Roberto says can be found in the knowledge economy? Well, one way to think about it is to contrast what happens in some of these frontier businesses with what happened in the previous most advanced forms of production, so in the mass production era. So innovative firms today operate very differently from the sort of most advanced firms of the past. So in mass production, we'd see a real rigid separation between the people who invent stuff, you know, the scientists, the designers, the technologists, and the people who make stuff on the production line. Whereas in innovative firms today, we don't really see that. There's much less of a rigid separation. Everyone has some kind of aspect of an inventor and innovator. And that means that innovation isn't just a kind of one-off episode. It can almost become perpetual. And if you think of a company like Google, that's really how they try to operate. Similarly, in mass production era, most workers had little autonomy, whereas in this kind of the advanced production practices we see today, there's a lot of decentralization and the idea that decision-making happens in different places around the world. You know, if you think about a lot of software companies that operate with these dispersed teams across different countries who communicate using channels like Slack and kind of work together on, you know, design sprints. It's a completely different model from a previous mass production model. And of course, innovation economy prizes creativity, collaboration, trust is really important. And finally, the relationship shifts between people and machines. So in the age of mass production, people were almost an extension of machine, right? So you know, the machines do some things and there's people there to operate them. Whereas in the most advanced firms now, actually people and machines have very different roles. Machines can do everything that can be automated or routinized, but we rely on people for the one thing they can do that machines definitely can't do, which is to imagine stuff. That's why we've called it Imagination Unleashed. That's the human quality. We have to be able to think of things that don't yet exist. That's fundamental to innovation. So the problem is, though, that unlike the era of mass production, which did spread to all parts of the economy and pretty much in all parts of the world, these advanced practices of innovation haven't spread. Instead, we see concentrations in a few places and among a few firms. So just to give a few examples, in the UK, 3/4 of private research and development is done in just 400 firms. There are huge regional gaps. So in the most innovative region, the east of England, we spend more than £900 per head of population on R&D, compared with Wales, where it's about £230. There's demographic divides. So far more men than women invent things. I think the most recent stats showed that women form just 8% of patent applicants in the UK. In the US, there's good data showing that kids from poorer backgrounds are much less likely to become inventors than kids from the top 10% of families socioeconomically, even when there are smarter kids in those families. And importantly, the trend is towards greater concentration. So we're not becoming more equal, we're becoming more concentrated. And within firms and sectors, we're seeing increasing monopolisation, as Roly mentioned. And this general picture is true everywhere, even in the countries that have the most highly educated populations. So Roberto Unger says that this problem is actually at the heart of the productivity issue that I raised, because if those advanced practices of production are concentrated in just a few firms, how can we possibly expect our economies to be productive? And of course, innovation and inequality go together. So some of our most innovative cities are also our most unequal, whether that's in the US, where San Francisco and Boston are amongst the top 10 cities for inequality, or in the UK, where Cambridge, it's our most innovative city by a country mile, if you count the number of patents per head of population. And it's also the most unequal if you look at incomes. So I'll just mention briefly some of the things that we suggest in the report, because I'm sure we'll discuss solutions after that. But we think that to tackle these issues, we can't just reproduce current models. This isn't just about trying to make everywhere like San Francisco, Boston, or Cambridge. We actually have to really think differently to reimagine our economy and the institutions that underpin it, so that many, many more people can take part in these kind of advanced production practices. And I think, in the context of this talk, I'll just highlight a few things. As Roly said, it is a very broad-ranging agenda. I think that three things that are really important are around the cultivation, the ownership, and access to knowledge. So in terms of cultivating knowledge, there's some real implications for how we educate young people, but also for how we learn over the life course. So if we're in an innovative economy, one where technology is going to keep rapidly changing, we need to be able to reinvent ourselves to learn new skills. And at the moment, vast majority of what we spend on education is for young people rather than for adults. I think that probably needs to shift. In terms of ownership, there's been a resurgence of interest, I think, internationally in new models of ownership for businesses, like employee ownership. So Bernie Sanders made a speech, I think, just yesterday, talking about his support for new models of business ownership. We could also think about new models of ownership for the raw materials of the knowledge economy. So data, obviously research base, and even the infrastructure of the internet itself. And there's, I think, one of the next talks in this series is about new models of ownership for data, so things like data trusts that could take data into public ownership. And then finally, the issue of access to knowledge and know-how. So much of government investment in research and innovation goes on creation of knowledge, like R&D, not on spreading it. And I think there's a huge amount we could do to think about how to give a much wider range of people access to these advanced production practices. And this definitely involves some new institutions, but also rethinking the role of existing ones. So on that note, I think libraries definitely have an important role to play, and I just wanted to finish with a quote I saw yesterday in a very timely way from Lady Bird Johnson, who I'm sure you know, wife of LBJ, and she said, perhaps no place in any community is so totally democratic as the library. The only entrance requirement is interest. There you go.
Very good. We have lots of interested people coming here, so thank you. Well, there's lots there to build on. Just before I come to Victor, I was very struck by your statistic about the 8% of businesses, patents filed by women. Whether it's some measure of the library factor, but we have a business and intellectual property centre here because of our roots as a patent library, which actually is an attempt to make libraries a point of business and SME innovation. And we have a network now around the country. And we're actually now, I may get the statistic wrong, but I think it's 55% at least of the businesses coming out of that are owned by women. So something, maybe it's a cultural, behavioural thing we can talk about, but we feel we're learning something about maybe barriers to knowledge in the business sector. But Victor, we've heard from Madeleine the beginnings, and it wasn't I know because I've read the report, a glimpse of a very, very wide-ranging prospectus. Did that ring true from your experience, and what are your reflections from different kinds of frontline experience?
I'm glad you went first, because I haven't got a report to talk about. But that's a great report, and it's got a lot of good things in it. I guess I'm quite struck by the here and now.
Yeah.
So I'm the chairman of an organisation, of a company. It's not social enterprise, called Visionable. Okay. It's a digital company. It provides secure video conferencing, I guess, to the NHS. I mean, like most video conferencing does one thing, and this does all of them, right? We've been doing this for 10 years. And I'm also the chair of something called Collaborate. And I wanted to see what it was like to wear different hats, because I'm also the chief executive of some organisation called Turning Point, but I wanted to put that aside because of my experiences in the knowledge world, the tech world to date, and my experiences as the chief executive of a company and an organisation that works with people at the sharp end of the inverse care law. In fact, my whole career has been at that end of things. The inverse care law, by the way, states that those people in need of health and social care the most tend to get it the least. And it's a bit of an obsession of mine, not least because it doesn't just apply to health, it applies to virtually everything else that I've experienced. So, if I may, reflect on the world of digital and IT and knowledge, and I'll say the following things, which may seem controversial, but it's awfully white. It's awfully white and awfully young and quite privileged and presumptive in its approach to virtually everything, which the best example of which is Facebook, actually. I think Facebook is incredibly presumptive, and the shock, imagine the look on Mark Zuckerberg's face when he's realised that actually young people are switching off and that that the presumption that just by creating Facebook the world would be a nicer place, the sort of what I call the kumbaya approach to technology, which doesn't involve, Cambridge Analytica or some of the more nefarious users of such technology. And I'm really glad the report says that we wouldn't want to recreate Silicon Valley or the other valleys around the place, because I think they are innocently dysfunctional. And by which I mean the people there aren't particularly nasty, they're just enclosed. They talk to people like them, they respect people like themselves, and they operate in this sort of innocent world, which is distinct from the world that I'm used to and that I live in. I live a weird life. I'm a member of the House of Lords, so everybody thinks I'm both rich and posh. I'm quite pleased that I'm comfortably middle class. There's nothing wrong with that. I wish that was the same for everyone. But I spend a lot of time, I just spend time talking to people, and people who aren't like me. And what I see, what I experience is what you've talked about, the increasing gap between the people that need knowledge most and get it the least. And it's really interesting. I'd like to deconstruct. I don't know what we mean by knowledge, because often it's knowledge defined by people who are a long way from the people who need the knowledge the most. You know, you need to know this, or you need to know that, or you need to do this. So an example would be health, actually. People are told, I mean, it's quite incredible, you know, the active life expectancy of a woman in Barking and Dagenham, according to the chief exec of Barking and Dagenham, is 53. Right? So at 53, you start falling apart if you're a woman, on average, right? Average active life expectancy. So that's the point where you start not being so active because things start happening. In Richmond upon Thames, it's over 70. Now, that's despite the fact that we have many channels of knowledge to that woman, telling her to eat less, exercise more, don't do this, don't do that, use the health service responsibly, the sort of, I have to say personally, nonsense that says that taking responsibility for your own health works for people like this particular woman. There's no evidence for that, by the way. It's very convenient for those people that have yoga mats and gym membership, but actually not a lot of evidence. And I think, first of all, we have to deconstruct what this knowledge, what do we mean by knowledge, and who owns it, and how it's who defines what knowledge is, and who needs it where. That's my first experience. Secondly, I think it's highly likely that some of the elements of the future will be created by people who look nothing like us. Generation Z, thankfully, is more comfortable with the notion of ideas coming from. Is it Generation Z? Yes, it is Generation Z. I'm not the sociologist, but more comfortable with ideas coming from people that don't look like them than, frankly, most of us in this room. Right? You should read a book. Well, I'm sure you've read loads of books, but there's a brilliant book by John Higgs called Adventures in the 21st Century. He talks about the Splutter test. Right? So this is the Splutter test, right, of millennials. Which is when somebody suggests a policy like, I don't know, the universal wage. There's a splitter of the Daily Mail and some Guardian readers. You know, the tea flies across the living room, while Generation Xers sit quite calmly, knowing full well that we're going to have to do something like that, because, you know. So I wonder about knowledge and who has it and who owns it, and in that, it helped me think about categories. So, and to help me think about this subject. And I guess there are the following categories of people in the so-called knowledge economy. The first are the owners, creators, people who own the means, or they own the Marxist ownership means of production. They own software, they own hardware, they own the content, they own the means of investment, they can shape markets, and that's what your report says they're actually doing. They can hold on to knowledge, and they do so at the large end, the Alphabets and the Googles and the Apples and the Microsofts and all that. But there's also quite a lot of people in the middles, and but they're a class of people. And then there's what I call the manipulators, people who don't own the knowledge, they don't own all, but what they can do is manipulate it. They can manipulate data, they can create software, goods, they can hack, they can code to a very high level, and they often may well be working for, but they don't own the stuff, they just can manipulate it, right? Then there are the servants. And when I say servants, you'll assume that I think I mean poor people necessarily. I don't. I did a report on fairness in London some time ago, in which I pointed out that, you know, middle-class people with jobs like lawyers and doctors and management consultants are under threat by these. They become servants. These are people who don't own or manipulate, but respond to the algorithms or technology created by manipulators or owners. And this refers to anyone who has a schedule that's beyond their control. I'm looking at you because it can be quite high up people, really. And then there's the underclass, and these people really worry me because often they're completely and utterly invisible. So it's not just the 11.5 million people that have access to all this stuff that we call, but they are victims of it. So 50% of people who try to access information about credit, family credits and welfare don't have access to a computer, right? And these are people who have no access, no control, no means to create software because they're out of work or in work that is so low paid that they couldn't afford access. The presumption is staggering. I go to government meetings and sometimes the presumption is that everybody's got a £600 phone. Well, they haven't. And there are some positive statistics about, people, 75% of people have been on the internet at any one time. I think I'd like to disaggregate that. It's a bit like the statistic about cancer, people getting seen for cancer. You disaggregate it and you point out, you soon find out that if you live in any one of the poorest areas, you're more likely to have your cancer diagnosed in A&E than through any one of the approved methods. So there's an underclass. Now, this underclass is not, they are subject to creation of their own knowledge, the atomization of knowledge. Knowledge which is unknown, unmeasured, and particularly just uncared for by the rest of us. And in that knowledge comes a threat to institutions through what I call negative movements. There are positive movements as well, but we can see the effect of negative movements in some of our current polity. So I guess I attempted to categorise things in a way that might help us have the debate. In terms of the welfare state, I think it's interesting that for the last few years, the welfare state, well, probably for the last, since the 80s, since 1979, the welfare state, welfare, the very idea of it has been seen as a burden. It was never created, it was never intended to be a burden. We're living in a city where the first poverty line was designed, right? William Booth. It wasn't seen as a burden, it was seen as a positive presumption of increased understanding of what it means to be human, as was the creation of libraries. I think it's quite interesting that we're having to argue for these things. Why would you why argue? Do you argue for breathing? It was seen as the evolution of the sense of humanity. I think we should be really concerned about the fact that we have to argue for it. That what's going on. And what's going on, I think, is this battle between people at the sharp and the inverse care law who deserve to define knowledge and access, and the institutions that, frankly, no matter how well-intentioned they are closed to those people, closed in very hard and fast ways, and they're in trouble. And the most kindly of them are in trouble. And we should all be worried by that, because the outcome is not necessarily positive. I think I'll end there.
Yeah, okay, Victor. I suspect everyone's already feeling the connections between both the contributions. I mean, running an institution, your final remarks about institutions wanting to be open but actually being increasingly closed is something that is feeling very real. I think we live with it every day. Different ways into that. One, we're talking about exclusion in different ways. Maybe to pick up on, Victor, your point about your three categories, including what you call the servants, the disempowered, those who feel on the receiving end of this. I think you described a digital underclass.
Yeah.
We increasingly hear a phrase digital by default for all kinds of public services. I noticed this week, the Philip Alston, the UN rapporteur on poverty, was sending a warning signal about the concept of a digital welfare state. How do we strike that balance? We want the affordances of digital, the opportunities, the efficiencies, and yet something is clearly happening, maybe to do with power or disempowerment, which has the opposite effect. I mean, maybe invite both of you just to reflect on. I mean, Victor, if you want to come back in first, please
you want to have a crack?
I'd love to hear it.
Well, one thing I've heard recently that really struck me is the idea that if we don't build equity into the way we do things, then by default we reproduce inequalities. So I think that's relevant to this idea of a kind of digital by default system. I mean, I think it's possible to make digital services that do reach more people, but if we don't think about inequalities of access, then we...
How do you build equity in? What's the difference between status quo and what should be happening with those services?
Well, so one thing that that is a sort of phenomenon of the internet more generally is that, for example, language is a key issue. I mean, English is, globally the dominant language of the World Wide Web, and that's excluding of a lot of people, right? And similarly, we don't, although we know a lot about how to make websites accessible for people with different access needs, that's still not ubiquitous across the internet. So these are some quite basic things about making, web-based services more equal.
I'm curious. I think the answer in advanced technologies or advanced manufacturing now and advanced product creation, there's this notion of co-production. Like most things that you buy now that are, flash, have been produced with someone like you. Right? I mean, everything from retail to technologies that are quite advanced. And that's because they know that if they want to sell to you, it's a good idea to understand who the hell you are and what it is that you want and how. Except if you're poor, which is really interesting. We know bugger all about what motivates poor people, but we blame them for being unmotivated, right? Which I find staggering. Right? And this by poor I mean the majority of people, right? The majority, not the people that are in the sort of, decently middle class. I mean, we have not a clue, and it's interesting because the NHS was co-produced with people. The apocryphal story of the NHS was that it wasn't started in Whitehall. It certainly wasn't invented by anybody anywhere near Silicon Valley. And yet, in Tredegar, in North Wales, people who were getting a terrible service designed a service themselves that Nye Bevan went and said I was going to Tredegarise the health system. Now, what does that tell us? The system it survived for 70 odd years, right? It is the religion of this country, not least because we have a visceral memory of it being one of the few services that we actually designed, right? What does that tell us about the welfare state? By which I mean the means by which we maintain people at a decent level of income. That's one aspect of it, right? It tells us that it will fail if it's not co-produced with the people who are meant to benefit from it. I mean, it's not difficult. And actually, I've been involved in many projects where this notion of digital by default has been tossed out by people who've got not a clue. Now, this isn't to say that digital wouldn't work, but if you don't understand the customer, why should it? Right? Why the hell should it work? And it doesn't. Right? It's a barrier. And in fact, I sometimes wonder whether it's a deliberate barrier, the presumption being that if it's hard, people won't use it. And it is hard, and people don't use it. In fact, if you look at the stats, most benefits aren't claimed. And that's the reason why we have food banks. So the solution isn't, in my view, that difficult. If you want to apply technology, understand the customer, understand the people who are going to use it. There's a report, I'll just say this and I'll shut up. There's a report that's been produced called the Popol report into technology in the NHS. A big chunk of thing it is. Well, anyway, it's quite a nice little thing. Usually these things are measured by the weight. But they after you've read through all the wonderful things that are possible in health technology, he says one thing which is worth saying. He says it's not so much about technology or IQ. He says that what will be required in the future is much greater emphasis on EQ, emotional intelligence, right, which is fundamentally about understanding our fellow human beings. I mean, it seems to me to be a blinding glimpse of the obvious.
There's a lot there, and I'm just trying to pin down a number of thoughts. One of the thoughts you've raised both in that and previous remarks is about defining what knowledge is, even, and who gets to do that. And again, very, very close to home, we're in the middle of what we and various other institutions, research and scientific, called the Knowledge Quarter. We because it is very remarkable. You've got universities and research institutions and libraries and so on around here. And we drew a little radius and we noticed that. And then we noticed, of course, within that Knowledge Quarter are 2 or 3 of the poorest parts of this city. And it's been very interesting as that community of organisations has grown up. We don't know how to do this, but we're realising that actually the best bit of knowledge exchange is not between the institutions or a one-way top-down out, but to actually get better at transferring knowledge of the communities who live here out of there to change what we do. And that's a very open-ended journey. But it's very difficult and trying to, in a sense, scary stuff, because it can go right to the origins of what we thought some of these institutions were set up to do. So Madeleine, I mean, I'm struck in your report, you talk about the role of institutions in what you call democratising the knowledge economy. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because by definition, institutions were born always in a previous era, and that is often their longevity and power and strength, and part of the coherence and continuity they bring. But equally, they can be blockers to exactly the kind of change that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, we do need public institutions if we're going to democratise the knowledge economy, because the type of the role that we need institutions to play won't be played by the private sector. So if we're thinking about kind of convening people in sort of companies, citizens, users, finance providers, knowledge providers, schools, colleges, etc., in an area to create a more democratic knowledge economy, that won't just happen. That has to be kind of purposefully done. I don't think we have exactly the right institutions to do it at the moment. One of the things that Nesta's been looking at, some of my colleagues are majoring on, is looking at innovation agencies and what they do, what they see their role to be. And these are fairly new organisations that have been springing up in different countries around the world to fund and support innovation.
State-owned, state-run?
Yeah, mainly state-run, mainly executive agencies. So rather than coming up with policy, they're implementing it. They've evolved a little bit from mainly just funding institutions to having a wider role in, for example, spreading knowledge, providing business support and so on. And now they're starting to think about, well, how can they deliver, say, mission-led orientation or innovation in the way that Mariana Mazzucato and the IIPP have been talking about. What's their role in making innovation more inclusive? And they don't have really the right people or skills to do that. So it's interesting to think about, well, how could you redesign those institutions? And one of the things is clearly just to bring in...
Is that because they're not immune to the younger, privileged, presumptive mindset?
Yeah, I think so. And also because of the types of roles they've had in the past, the type of people who come to work there often have, backgrounds in... in science and technology, because that's what they thought they were there to do. And now if you're thinking, well, we need to support social enterprises or need to build collaborations between citizens and companies to develop new types of products, that's a completely different way of working, right? So I think one thing is to understand who works for those organisations and how you might broaden out the range of skills and roles they could do. But I think there are new roles for existing institutions. So I was struck in preparing for this at how many libraries have makerspaces. I didn't know that. We researched makerspaces in the past, so these kind of workshops where you can come and fabricate stuff using high-tech machinery, but I didn't know the libraries were taking on that role, and I think that's fascinating. A colleague who's commentated on this report from a library's perspective has suggested that libraries could play a role in facilitating innovation competitions. So again, something the government does is distribute funding by inviting innovators to respond to challenges, like we need a new kind of high-tech battery, for example. But if you really want a wide range of people responding to those challenges, you need to find a way of reaching them that goes beyond the government's existing networks with businesses, and libraries could play a really strong role in that. So I think there are new roles.
I think we feel probably that libraries in a way are a microcosm of the institutional question. More generally, they are often micro institutions in communities, not always very well funded, but usually with quite a lot of inherited expectations. And classically, their success or failure is unevenly distributed. Some are struggling for their role. Some are incredibly dynamic because they've rethought their way into to their contribution to knowledge creation and knowledge access. And at their best, they may be, and we're a bit different, we're very big and grand and London-based, but at their best, they are ones which maybe have lower barriers to entry than, say, some of the other cultural or scientific institutions, which can feel forbidding. But Victor, what's your feeling on the institution?
I liked what I was hearing about what you're doing at the British Library, and frankly, I don't think you have any choice, because I think the issue is movements threaten institutions that refuse or don't understand the push to change, and most institutions did come out of movements in the first place, right? And they are embodiment of an expression, and so that lack of dynamism usually comes from the top. I say this as someone who looked at organisational psychology for a while. I studied this for a while, and this question of leadership and how things are led, I think is quite important when you look at the future of institutions and how porous they are to new ways of doing things. I'm always struck by the work that Collaborate does, because we don't start at the top of any, well, we usually we don't, of any organisation or system that we're asked to help or collaborate. It's not about collaboration for any, for the sake of it. It's about collaboration in the interests of those people that will be the users or will give permission for the use of or need services. So it's collaboration in the interests of the future of services to the public. And I use the word services to the public deliberately, because what is a public service now is, since the banking crisis, I think is up for debate.
How do you mean? Sorry.
Well, you own a chunk of a bank. Is that a private service or a public one? We all found out in 2008 that the banks need us as much as we need the bank. Does that make them a purely private affair? No, it doesn't. If you're Tesco's and you earn 30% of the grocery market, does that make you a totally private concern? I mean, some of you will have heard of the concept of moral hazard. It seems to me that
the phrase "too big to fail" tells you something.
So the question of what is a public service and what isn't is up for debate. I prefer the word service to public because it cuts across what we would commonly think of what is public, private, and not for profit. But I digress. The point about the need.
We might come back to it. Yeah.
The point about the need for I think libraries are a really good example, and the reason why they're a good example is, for all the reasons you've said, is that in the modern idiom of talk about public services currently is almost a bad thing, something that we need to cut or manage or whatever. Libraries have been subject to big society. I mean, kindness, which I'm all for, right? And I think kindness is a wonderful thing, but it's just not equally distributed, which is why we have public services in the first place, right? They've been subject to the vagaries of who happens to be the population they exist in when they've got the time to think or do something about them, and they've been subject to quite imaginative transformation. The point is that a deliberate attempt to create or recreate what a library should be in a community depends on the collaboration of that community across public, private and not-for-profit in the interests of the users. And that is not an accident. That is something that you can do in a deliberate way, which is what Collaborate's been doing. And I think it needs to be done because I think it's very difficult if you run an institution that's been around for hundreds of years, like some of our universities, for instance, where I don't blame them. They're paid to be closed. I mean, that's what they do, right? And then suddenly there's this imperceptible shift which becomes more and more present, that perhaps closed university institutions aren't what's needed now. And your job is to stand there and say, no, well, that's difficult. And eventually you will get run over. It's just a matter of time. The only way you can recreate these institutions is to collaborate, right, in the interests of the people usually paying for them or giving them permission to exist in a community. So I guess that's my take on what we need to do.
It's really interesting. I think back to my BBC background. The BBC is just coming up for its 100th birthday in 2022. But a lot of internal debates there, because actually it's not the 100th birthday of the public service corporation we know today. It's the 100th birthday of a commercial company that was set up by the radio manufacturers, which realised in its early years of existence that its social impact and the social risk of its sheer power was such that actually it effectively, under its chief exec, Lord Reith, changed its whole constitution. And America took a different route there and didn't institutionalise its broadcasting. And I think there are lessons. It's not a God-given choice about where you place these things.
The BBC, I would argue, is another example of an institution that is, in a sense, trying to remain the same in the face of real pressure. It's real pressure to shift, and it hasn't developed or designed or brought in a mechanism to engage with that, and it hasn't realised the implications of not engaging, and it hasn't realised the implications of not engaging. Do you see what I mean? I suspect there are some very smart, very terrified people at the top of the beam.
Probably right. I'm to bring us slightly full circle, Madeleine, back to where you kicked us off with the title of your report, which was Imagination Unleashed. And you touched on this thought here, but we are talking about, when we talk about knowledge these days, it often is about, it almost a proxy for technology of certain companies. It's an odd shift when you think about it. The knowledge economy often feeds back to tech. And you talked about people and machines, and that our advantage is that machines can't imagine and don't have imagination. But there is concern that actually, nonetheless, the number of actual human jobs shrinks and shifts, and you may have an elite of imaginative people. But if I understand your report correctly, the thought is you actually almost want to democratise the right to imagine. Is that right? And the right. Can you just finally bring that thought to life? And then I'm very keen to get questions from the floor.
And this really comes from Roberto Unger, who has this idea that we should all be living the biggest life possible, the fullest life possible. So he really doesn't like the idea, for example, of universal basic income. He hates the idea that, that machines are going to take all our jobs. So what we should do is just compensate the people who lose their jobs and their purpose in life by giving them some money and letting them, get on with whatever they want to get on with, not working. He feels that you can find freedom through work, and that we should all aspire to be the biggest that we can be. And we find that quite inspiring, because quite a lot of the narrative around the future of technology and so on is really negative, isn't it? That we're going to lose all of our jobs and robots are going to take over and all we can do is kind of stem the decline or whatever. And I think actually, no, there is a sort of a bigger picture there. It's quite utopian, but yeah.
But we need our utopians.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to interrupt for a second. I mean, I loved the title, Imagination Unleashed. The notion of democratising imagination is a really nice one. Everyone, the one thing that most humans have is an imagination, and it's also the thing that we don't allow those at the sharp end of this inverse care law to express. Yeah. Some of the lucky ones get to express it anyway. You can bet your life, I'll make a bet on it, I think the next Einstein's going to be a black guy. It's going to be. Do you know the word real McCoy? One of the progenitors of the term real McCoy was that it actually was a black guy who kept inventing these things that actually bloody worked. You don't know about him because he's a black guy. Right? So you need to, I think, it's not so much democratise. I kind of see how that word gets used, it gets systematised. We have to be honest enough to know that we don't look for imagination in the places where it actually happens the most. Yeah. Imagine the imagination that you need to get from Iraq as a refugee to Dover. Yeah. Think about that. Even if you're feeling dubious about refugees, imagine what that takes, right? We need those people. On the universal basic income, I don't know, it doesn't pass the splutter test for a lot of people, but what is happening, this is why I'm thinking about the here and now, what is happening now in health is that some of the technologies are about disrupting the NHS. And I'm not saying the NHS doesn't need disrupting, but if that's the only purpose, we might lose the the co-production piece. Mm-hmm. But more to the point, some of the technologies actually are making people a lot poorer. And I would argue with Mr. Holger.
Which ones?
Well, I mean, you only have to read some of the books about the conditions in some of the factories owned by Amazon to have a clue. Yeah. That's happening now. So my argument is, don't dismiss the universal basic income. Don't dismiss it. I think a lot of solutions are going to be and, not either or. But then, because you have to deal with what's happening now while you're thinking about what needs to happen in the future.
Let's open the conversation to anyone who wants to take part. And I think we have microphones. Please, yes. So just take the floor. Thank you.
I was very struck by. Oh, wrong. I beg your pardon. I'm rather elderly. I was very struck by the percentage of people you said who could access benefits, who cannot because of the lack of access, lack of knowledge to the digital world. Yeah. I think one thing that has made that even worse is the fact that so many institutions, boroughs, local authorities have withdrawn telephone access. I, for instance, live in Southwark. You cannot get access to any service unless you go online. But I was very surprised at this percentage you mentioned. You said 60%, I think you told.
50% of people who are digitally excluded, most likely to be 50% of those seeking help on tax and tax credit issues do not have access to a computer.
Yeah, I think that is extraordinary. And so many institutions, I think even the British Library.
We do have people who do answer telephones, but nonetheless.
Yes, anyway, I would like your comment on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think it's a pretty disturbing fact. My experience would tell me that it's probably more than that, actually. And access to these systems, that technology can act as a demand barrier. A way of managing demand is to make sure that things get filtered. Food banks, I think, are one of the products of that. I think it's generally shaming anyway to not be able to get hold of this stuff, and then so I think there's a problem. But what really worries me about it is when you look at the research that's done on digital exclusion and the reasons why people at the sharp end don't access it. I looked at the lists of reasons, and it says all this stuff about coverage and all that. And then right at the end it says on them that motivation seems to be the biggest barrier to digital inclusion to overcome, especially for low-income groups. Now that tells me two things, two arguments. All those people have gone from zero to hero in the digital world. Well, I was motivated. Why can't they? There you go. And secondly, it indicates the fact that they know nothing. They know nothing. Tesco's know more about what motivates you than it does about these people. It's like, well, shouldn't we find out? I mean, if you want to design a service digital service that people are going to use on the sharp end of the welfare, talk to them. Design it with them. In fact, employ them to design it with them. I mean,
just putting all the responsibility on the individual, right?
I think it begs another more fundamental question, which is why we haven't done this. There are people much smarter than me that have arrived at this particular insight.
Madeleine, anything to add on that? Or from your perspective? No. Okay, thank you very much. Other questions? At the back, yes? Is there? Thank you.
I think an interesting question is the value of knowledge or information or data. And it's significantly commoditized. So in an environment where we're trying to look at the value benefits of services and what have you, when you compare a doctor to an algorithm is really quite an interesting challenge, which also compares the question of a library. If you can get that book online, it takes away people's perception of the value of the community around the library. Any thoughts?
Interesting.
Very. I'll kick off for a second, I think, and then, but while you two reflect on this, but we'll all want to actually think our way through that, because I think there's a question you've raised which I've wondered about and never come to an answer around perceived value, and how sometimes the digital world can offer you almost exactly the same apparent outcome, but something at an emotional level has gone away. I think people find that you hear people talking about music in different ways, that when music became divorced from a physical item, somehow it became more disposable and less meaningful in a way. And I think we in the library sector, of course, encounter this debate around the consumption of books, for instance, and it's not just libraries versus other forms of provision, but physical books as against digital books, and it's been very striking that the predictions, mostly from the tech industry, about an inevitable disappearance of the book as the physical item have simply proved to be false in the face of the brute facts of actual real people making real choices in bookshops, and actually the physical publishing sector is very healthy, and ebooks have found their level, and it's a very healthy level, very useful, it's expanded the market, but it hasn't displaced something. And whether there's, if that's irrational, then it's an extremely interesting bit of irrationality from which we can probably learn a number of lessons. It relates to your human being on the end of a telephone in your local authority, I think. And final observation from me on this, and I think the point you raise is a real, and it is a threat to institutions, but equally, certainly for this particular institution, we've noticed that the more we, for instance, digitize our collections and put them online, the longer the queue seems to be to actually want to get in the building every day to somehow either be here or be with others studying, or indeed get closer to the physical in some way. So I think it's a really good question, and it probably has different applications in different sectors. So I'm going to invite.
Yeah, just a quick reflection on libraries. So in a past life, I did some research on libraries and what people value about them, and as you say, there's a whole range of things that people value about libraries that aren't just access to the book. So like I said, the community, being with other people, various activities that people put on, and actually people were valuing libraries even if they didn't go to them, which I thought was really interesting. People see them as important institutions. So yeah, that's just a quick reflection.
Following things, the Queen will not be going to an algorithm. She'll have a doctor. Personal doctor, actually. And why? Because I would wager that most people in this room would rather talk to a human being about their emotional or medical needs than an algorithm. This isn't to say that algorithms aren't of use. They are of huge use. But it's about what they do, what they're for. And I think you mention it in your report, or at least allude to it, or you sort of allude to it's not the wrong word anyway, but you sort of refer to it, which is the notion that, and I think you do as well actually, I bet book clubs have gone through, the numbers of book clubs opening up have gone through the roof since the rise of digital. And that's because something interesting, I think, is becoming more apparent, and particularly in Generation Z, which is that the human contact, the nature of what it is to be in relationship with someone, is becoming precious. And the real risk is, particularly in health, is that you get two tiers. The poor get, if you've seen the film Elysium, no? Oh, you should see it, it's brilliant. But anyway, the notion that the poor get the algorithm, which, by the way, has been written by a load of white guys who don't understand, literally don't recognise what my issues are, what your issues are, and there's some evidence for that, and they get the mistakes. The middle class get a bit of algorithm and a bit of human, if they've got sharp elbows, who understand how the system works, and the rich get a human, always. Right? Now, in my view, that would be wrong, and we must guard against it. And so what we really need to do is understand, let's just be honest with each other, we actually, humans like humans, that's, we are social beings, right? And therefore, the purpose of this knowledge is to enhance our ability to understand each other more. So the more it can do that, it has a purpose. The less it can do that, questionable, right? Particularly when it's aligned with increasing the value of the company that's designed to take the doctor out and put the algorithm in, right? So we just have to be wary. We have to guard our intention, if the intention is better healthcare and better relationship with our health, humans generally are good. So what to extend that example a bit further, the algorithm, if anything, should work. It should give you more time with your doctor, not less. It should give you more of an experience of a relationship with your health, not less. But that should be the same for everybody. Otherwise, we've got a problem. I think on the human bit, I just love the notion that the British Library, I just like the idea that you put this stuff online and people want, because what that gives you a fantastic opportunity to do is to convene and create and co-create and look at who's in that queue, what do they want, how can you create models whereby they might get to know each other, get to become something more than a queue, I'm sure you're on it, but also who's not in that queue that those people might know. I mean, when you go to the South Bank, I noticed that the South Bank, you love to go to the South Bank, it's lovely, isn't it? It's really nice. But I noticed that all the people serving the drinks are black, and all the people going to the concerts are lovely. And why? Well, what is that about, right? And I just wonder, 6 degrees of separation, most people in this room will know somebody who isn't quite like you, and most people in that queue will know somebody. So what is it that they're thinking about those people that might help you get to those people so they can be part? I think you're on the edge of a movement there. And I think that could be really powerful.
Very, very stimulating. More questions? Yes, please. In the front row.
Yeah, Simon Bishop. I just wanted to, when you were talking there, I was thinking that we live in an economy where, you could say the coercive forces of competition actually are constantly driving sort of new technologies. And actually, there are parts of the economy, health, social and environmental parts of the economy where actually we might need more human beings to be doing it. And yet at the same time, Keynes, for instance, in the 1930s, said that by now we'd be working 15 hours a week because productivity would be such in the future that we'd actually capture that. But of course what we've done is we've handed over the productivity benefits to, I want to use the word capitalist, but it's gone into finance, it's gone into those sorts of sectors, and we haven't been able to take advantage of that. And ordinary people, are indebted. £30,000, I think, is the average per household. Poorer people are working maybe doing 2 or 3 jobs to sort of try and survive. And the impact of that, I want you to maybe touch on that, how being indebted, if you like, enslaves you to the point you can't go on strike. Maybe when you rented, now you can't, you've got a mortgage to pay. And it enslaves you to a sort of system where you're working too much, so how can you have the time to actually access knowledge? I'm very interested in John McDonnell's plan for the 4-day week. I think it's time that, as people, we took back some of that productivity gain and used it for knowledge. But anyway.
Thank you. Lots to unpack there. I mean, Madeleine, you talked about productivity being stagnant, but I mean, in a way, this is a lateral question saying whose productivity for whose benefit and to what end. And maybe both of you just to reflect on that question.
Yes, you're right. Basically, you're, in terms of the gains from productivity going to the owners of capital, that's one of the strong messages from Thomas Piketty's work and everyone else. So I think one of the keys to shifting that is to think about ownership, and we touched on that earlier. Who owns them?
Just unpack that a little bit. So in other words, some of your new models of business that you're talking about are an effort to repatriate some of that productivity gain closer to home. Is that right?
Exactly. There's lots of already loads of experiments in different models of business ownership. Some of them not new, not very new at all. And you're on the board of social enterprise. You're the chair, so you know all this work very well. And also, I think in this report we call for more experimentation in models of ownership, not just for companies but for a whole range of things. So data, intellectual property, knowledge, and so on. And we put forward this idea that you could think of ownership less as a kind of inalienable sort of single unified property right, and more as something that you hold in as a custodian for others to benefit from. And I think the community interest company is quite a nice model of that in practice, where you've got this company model set up where assets are held for the benefit of communities. So even though a company could operate like a private company, there are restrictions on the distribution of dividends, for example, and there's this kind of long-term commitment to delivering for a particular community. And I think you could see those types of experiments in different models of ownership in different sort of classes of property, if you like.
Really, well, I'd love to come to Victor. I mean, I'm just reflecting, connecting this with the previous conversation, but also if we're learning to understand a little bit more about the value that's generated and the enjoyment encoded in productive, actual human encounters, then there may be a win-win here, where actually the value, if you can somehow put the accent on those imaginative and human encounters, then it's both productive, but it's not necessarily a matter of slimming down the hours so much as actually transferring where people's energies go.
Yeah, just as a quick reflection on Victor's points, I think there's something about how technologies are deployed, right? So it doesn't have to be an algorithm or a doctor, but that you could use technologies to enhance the role that doctors play. I mean, a bit to the point you made at the end, you should be getting more time with your doctors, and there are things that technology can do better than people.
In a more timely way to the right human encounter, rather than...
and it's really interesting. Go to your GP and they spend a lot of time on Google, you might be wondering why you couldn't actually just do that bit yourself, but there are things that doctors can do that technology can't do, and we'd rather...
Well, Victor, you've thought about this.
That's why I set up Visionable. For that very reason. Because I think doctors, when we set up Visionable, it was to work with clinicians and patients to develop technology that they would see as useful, as opposed to technology that was useful to the company designing it, and so far so good. It's a slower way of doing it, but it's more rewarding and it's values driven. To your point, I think it's a really good one. I think your report does a really good job of kind of debunking. I'm no economist, right? But the only thing I know about economists is that they tend to think of human beings as rational, and the experience of most of us is that they're not. And it's in their beautiful irrationality that we get these relationships that are all potential to do something. And I think that you have a very good point, actually. It's Maslow's hierarchy, isn't it? The self-actualization, which is denied to those that we then castigate for not being self-actualized, right? And you only have to go to a food bank to see how critical that is. I've been doing a series of podcasts of late with Collaborate and talking to people about this notion of collaboration. And I spoke to the woman who runs the Trussell Trust about this, and people underestimate how much time is taken up by worry. When you're poor, worry saps imagination. It saps imagination. It saps the critical faculties necessary to turn imagination into ideas, and ideas into actions, and actions into new things. So we have to pay attention to that, and it's happening to a lot of our fellow citizens. The economic models that drive it are remarkably resistant to change. I remember Will Hutton talking about the rentier mob in his book The State We're In a long time ago now, and we're still in that state. In fact, if anything, it's got worse. So one wonders what might shift it, and in saying that, I'm not one of these I often get accused. I was at a party conference, I won't tell you which one, and I was talking about a system which made a service free at the point of access, and according to need, and somebody in the audience said, I put it to you, sir, you're a Marxist. The point I'm trying to make is that new economy is happening right now. And in that sense, it's not an experiment. Let me tell you what I mean. The 11th largest taxpayer to the British economy is a social enterprise. The fastest growing form of business is a social enterprise. If you're a woman or black, you're more likely to lead a social enterprise than someone who looks like you, sir. In the poorest areas, social enterprises are being developed by ground up, so they're more likely to exist and develop in those poor areas. The top five social enterprises pay more tax and so I said this once at a conference, saying, well, maybe we should find a way how to pay less, right? But, you know, pay more tax than Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Apple put together. The contribution of social enterprises, all the examples in your report are a form of social enterprise to the British economy of social enterprises is larger than agriculture. Now, the question you might ask yourself is, why don't you know that? You know, why don't we know that? What is going on? That movement is happening, whether we like it or not. It is inevitable. The question is a matter of time. And Generation Z want to work with meaning. And it's not because they don't want to get rich, because it's possible to get rich and live well, right? And do the right thing and enhance and sustainable. It's because they're well aware that they have no choice. It's not a case of an option or some statistical analysis or what the Chancellor's Checker said. We're running out of time. And Generation Z know that really viscerally. They know it. That's why you've got a 12-year-old halting traffic in Oxford Street. I think she's 12 or 14, you know. And we haven't really caught up with that yet. The model is there. It's been growing. It's going to happen. It's a case of lead, follow, or get the hell out of the way. Yeah. Generation Z ain't going to go into this good night quietly.
And we haven't talked about the big one, but you do touch on the sustainability question in your the environmental question in your report.
We do touch on it, but probably not nearly as much as we should. Actually, it's a bit kind of
but I think that's
almost
interesting
like
to bring it back to motivation and meaning.
It's the big issue of the day.
Probably time for one more. Yes, certainly. Just the gentleman there.
I wanted to ask you, what's your opinion from a welfare perspective on programs such as the one laptop per child in terms of access to knowledge and bridging the gap in inequality?
Thank you. So that was the one laptop per child.
This is typical, right? I can guarantee you, in fact, I've read something about this, and you may know more about it than I do, that the children weren't asked. So one laptop per child is a wonderful idea. But unfortunately, you need electricity to operate it. Yeah. And perhaps the electricity may have been the priority before the laptop. And actually before the electricity, maybe clean water. And before that, access to decent healthcare and food, the brain, and the static human being, being the most energy-using thing you've got. So I put it as these sorts of initiatives, I put them, they're episodic. What's required is systemic interventions. And in order to do that, you need to work with the people at the sharp end. No doubt there's some kid somewhere who's going to be the next genius who got a laptop. Good luck with that. That's fantastic. But as an answer to the question, nah. Not even close. And frankly, presumptuous. Bordering on disrespectful.
Anything to add on that?
Well, yeah, I totally agree. And even without going beyond the kind of, access to water and so on as higher priorities, even just to make the laptop thing work. Yes, of course, you need electricity, you need teachers, you need people who have the skills to kind of make people help people make the use of these things, and that just hasn't been the case with that programme. So yeah, no, sorry.
Well, but I mean, maybe just the broader question around those kinds of interventions: co-create, talk to those you're trying to work with, and shape it correctly. Okay, thank you. We do have time for one more, so if there is and there as well, or maybe two more. Anyway, one more, yes, from you. Thank you.
Hi. Just on that last note, I just wanted to bring it back to public libraries, because I think if you go into any public library, you'll see everything you've been talking about play out in human form. So those 60% who don't have access to computers for benefits will be in the public library using those computers, and they'll be next to the more privileged people as well, accessing the regular services. And I don't think you get that in many other spaces, you know that. But also, I think it's forgotten that the biggest, the widest demographic of public library users are the 15 to 24 age bracket. And, that is the millennials. And what could be done to well, first of all, the answer is to invest in these services and spaces, and laptops could be lent as well as books and so on. But what more could be done to measure and gather data from these spaces in order to answer these questions, do you think? Because so far, the success of public libraries is generally only measured on the number of people that come in and out of the doors and the number of books borrowed. So I just wondered what innovations in data gathering you could think about.
Thank you. Well, very touching to bring it back to libraries at the end, and thank you. And I will ask my colleagues just to give final reflections on that, and maybe even more broadly. I mean, very briefly on first of all on the age demographic. Yes, we find that here. When I first came here, I was intrigued to ask. I was thinking, is this going to be an aging demographic of users? And not at all. It's very, very evenly spread, including a very extremely healthy showing of those 16 to 24s and 34s. And of course, that's right. They're finding their way. They need safe spaces. There are not many places people can think, and libraries are one of them. And we are trying to get better at measuring, but I'm afraid sophisticated measurement of usage is something generally that the local authorities who run these services just can't afford. And it is very, very simple metrics, but I think it's a good challenge as we, I say in our sector, collectively make the case really at the very, very highest level for what is really going on in this extraordinary distributed set of spaces, rather than what maybe prejudice tells you might be. So thank you for the intervention. Final thoughts really on that, or drawing threads together more. Madeleine, anything?
So one of the themes that's come up today that I think is really important is around whose knowledge is valued. So I really like the points you made on that. And just to mention one intervention that I came across recently that the British Science Museum has been promoting. I think they published something on it this week. So it's called Access Lab, and it's about helping people who are not academic scientists access knowledge from the academic science community. Because it's really hard to get hold of academic papers and make sense of them if you do get hold of them, right? But so what they've done is pair up people who have a scientific question with people who are scientific researchers, but rather than pairing them with someone who has a specific knowledge to answer the question they've got, they pair them with someone whose expertise lies elsewhere. So if you have a question about the environment, they might pair you with, say, an astrophysicist or whatever. And the goal is then to kind of equalise the relationship a little bit, so they're both non-expert in the domain where the question applies, right? So they both have to learn together about that domain, but the scientists can bring their knowledge of accessing academic research, and the member of the public can bring their knowledge of the problem. And I think that's a really nice model for thinking about how we might democratise knowledge a bit. I don't know how you scale it up, but I think that sense of valuing people's knowledge wherever they come from and getting rid of hierarchies is really, really strong.
And creating a memorable and imaginative human encounter, which is been one of our themes tonight. Victor.
No, I think that's a really good question. Do you work for the British Library by any chance? I just wondered. Do you work for a library?
No.
Okay. Oh, it's interesting. It's such a brilliant advert. I'll say, the following things. Firstly, I think the question I would ask about the demographic age is which 16 to 34s are coming in, particularly in London. You've got 300 languages spoken, so which 16 to 34-year-olds it seems to me a relevant question. It's great that they're coming, but which ones? Secondly, I think we need to think about, I don't know how we measure information. I know that Tesco's, I keep coming back to Tesco's, I'm actually on the board of the co-op group, so I'm mentioning the competition, go to co-op. But if they really value quality data, and they, whether they still do it or not, they don't know. They actually pay people to sit and watch people come in and out of the stores. They collect. Now, that data for them is as important as the quant data, because it's about behaviour. And I wonder about whether there's a partnership between you and the universities, actually even retailers, to start quantifying, valuing qual data. Because it's very, very valuable. It's very powerful. That's the stuff that drives design. Which leads me to the one of the things I've noticed is the high street is under pressure, and shops is changing, and 30,000 tills are taken out and replaced by these things that I still can't use, you know, and it changes the role of what it means to go shopping. And I wonder whether there are opportunities to recreate that space with libraries, because ultimately I think libraries are becoming manufacturers. I use the word manufacture in advisedly, but the kind of spaces where relationships can be built, and that can be measured, and indeed should be measured. It's all about whether you value the methodology of those measures, but they're potentially hugely powerful. I mean, they created me. I went to the library every day pretty much, for, you know, but certainly from the age of 13, 12, you know, there was the only way they had books. We couldn't afford them. So, but there's something else. Relationships can be created. I think, finally, I've come to this, I wrote this down, but it turns out that it may well be true. There are three things that I've come to the conclusion about this whole concept of welfare and technology. One, we have to engage people, and I don't just mean people like us, we have to engage. There are 4 rules of engagement, we haven't got time to tell you about that. We need to collaborate. Collaboration is not an accident, it's an intention. There are things that you can do to collaborate. And we have to understand movements. Movements are the new institutions, but we have to understand them as they are movements, which requires a different kind of leadership.
On that note, sadly, we are timed out, and apologies for those of you who may have had questions. I just want to thank everyone for coming and for your attention and engagement. I want to thank our partners at IIPP for once again helping to shape and host real debate. But in particular, if I could ask you to thank our very special guests tonight, Madeleine Gabriel and Victor Adebowale. Thank you.